The silver clattered and shattered against marble flooring. Liam Hale, the Mafia boss's 8-year-old autistic son, screamed, hands clamped over his ears, body rigid with sensory overload. The Imperial's exclusive dining room froze in collective judgment, wealthy patrons turning toward the disruption with expressions ranging from irritation to thinly veiled disgust. But across the room, near the kitchen entrance, where the less important guests were seated, a black single mother looked past the panic and saw only the pain. Her daughter Maya, 7 years old and impossibly intuitive, stood from her modest table and approached the screaming child with gentle determination. She raised her hand slowly, palm out, fingers spread, and held it steady in Liam's line of sight. A silent invitation. A non-verbal promise that said, "I see you. I understand. You're safe." Liam's screaming stopped. His hand rose to mirror hers, palm to palm, not quite touching, but connected through the space between them. Dominic Hale, the most feared man in the city, stood helpless beside his son, watching a child he'd never met accomplish in seconds what his millions couldn't buy: genuine connection with the boy he loved but couldn't reach. And in that impossible moment, the Mafia boss learned that true power wasn't control, intimidation, or wealth. True power was the quiet empathy of a 7-year-old girl who possessed the one thing his empire couldn't provide: the ability to meet his son exactly where he was, without fear or judgment, or the need to fix what wasn't broken. Stay with me until the end, because this story will shock you to the core. Before we begin, hit subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Now let's get back into the story. The Imperial existed in hushed reverence, the kind of exclusive restaurant where silence itself was a luxury commodity. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across white linen tablecloths. Silverware gleamed with the particular shine of items polished by hands that would never dine here. The air carried the subtle fragrance of old money mixed with new power, expensive perfume, aged wine, and the metallic scent of ambition disguised as civility. This wasn't a place where people simply ate. It was a stage where the elite performed wealth for audiences who already understood the script, where business deals were sealed over $30 appetizers, where politicians met donors in corners designed for discretion, where organized crime figures like Dominic Hale could conduct the legitimate theater of their illegitimate empires. Dominic had entered 20 minutes earlier with his son Liam's hand gripped carefully in his own. He was 42, wearing a custom Italian suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, his presence commanding immediate attention from every server and sommelier. The staff recognized him, not from social pages or business magazines, but from the whispered intelligence that service workers maintain about who truly controls the city beneath its legal surface. He was here as a father tonight, desperately trying to give his 8-year-old son something approximating normal experience. It was an attempt that had been failing from the moment they'd walked through the Imperial's doors. Liam was nonverbal, on the autism spectrum, brilliant in ways that conventional measurements couldn't capture, but struggling with the chaos that neurotypical people processed effortlessly. The restaurant's ambient noise, conversations layering over each other, silverware clinking against china, the subtle hum of kitchen operations, the barely perceptible vibration of climate control systems, was assault rather than atmosphere to his heightened sensory awareness. Dominic had tried to control every variable. He'd reserved the quietest corner table, had called ahead to request dimmed lighting in their section, had brought Liam's weighted vest and noise-canceling headphones, had reviewed the menu at home so Liam would know exactly what to expect. He'd applied the same meticulous planning to this dinner that he used for complex criminal operations, identifying risks, implementing countermeasures, ensuring desired outcomes through overwhelming preparation. But you couldn't plan away neurodivergence, couldn't control sensory sensitivity through strategic thinking, couldn't intimidate a nervous system into processing stimuli differently. The meltdown had started small, Liam's hand moving toward his ear in the gesture Dominic had learned meant too loud, too much, can't process. Then the rocking had begun, subtle at first, but accelerating. Then the humming, Liam's attempt at self-regulation that was drawing attention from nearby tables. Dominic had tried the techniques every expensive therapist had taught him: quiet voice, gentle redirection, offering the headphones, suggesting they step outside briefly. Nothing had worked. The sensory overload was building, and Dominic recognized the signs. They had perhaps 60 seconds before full meltdown, before his son would scream and the entire restaurant would witness the vulnerability that Dominic Hale's reputation couldn't protect against. That's when the silverware had fallen, not thrown, just released from Liam's overwhelmed hands as motor control gave way to system overload. The clatter against marble had been explosive in the hushed dining room, and Liam's scream had followed immediately after, the sound of a nervous system completely overwhelmed, desperately trying to communicate distress in the only way available. Every face in the Imperial had turned toward them, not with sympathy or understanding, but with the cold judgment of people who viewed disability as failure of control, as embarrassing disruption to their expensive evening, as evidence that Dominic Hale couldn't even manage his own child. Dominic had frozen, his carefully constructed control shattered by the one thing his power couldn't fix. He'd built an empire through violence and strategy, had eliminated rivals and secured territory, had created systems of loyalty through fear and calculated generosity. But he couldn't calm his own son, couldn't provide the connection Liam needed, couldn't bridge the gap between his neurotypical parenting and his son's neurodivergent experience. He'd been standing there helpless, aware that they were about to be asked to leave, that his son's distress was becoming spectacle, that his reputation for control was crumbling in real time before an audience of the city's most powerful gossips. And then Maya had approached. The girl had moved with the quiet confidence of children who haven't yet learned that helping strangers might be dangerous or inappropriate. She was 7 years old, wearing a dress that was slightly too small and shoes that had clearly been polished to cover wear. Her hair was gathered in elaborate braids that must have taken hours to create, the kind of careful styling that spoke of a mother's love expressed through limited resources and infinite patience. She'd crossed the dining room from her table near the kitchen entrance, the section where the Imperial seated guests they deemed insufficiently wealthy for premium placement. Her mother, Danielle Brooks, had stood immediately, reaching after her daughter with the protective instinct of single mothers who'd learned that the world wasn't always safe for Black children approaching powerful white men. But Maya had already reached Liam, had already positioned herself in his line of sight without crowding his personal space, had already raised her hand in that slow, deliberate gesture that somehow communicated, "I understand. I see you. You're not alone." And impossibly, miraculously, Liam's screaming had stopped. His hand had risen to mirror hers, and the connection, palm to palm across the space neither touched, had provided what every expensive intervention had failed to deliver: regulation, safety, understanding. Dominic had stared at this child, at her mother now standing protectively nearby, at the impossible gift they'd just given without knowing who he was or what he could offer in return. And in that moment, everything changed. Dominic Hale had built his empire on the principle that everything and everyone could be controlled through the strategic application of pressure, financial, physical, or psychological. Territory disputes were resolved through calculated displays of overwhelming force. Rival organizations learned to respect boundaries after witnessing what happened to those who didn't. Politicians stayed bought because Dominic understood that sustained loyalty required both carrot and stick, both generous compensation and the implicit threat of exposure. For 30 years, this philosophy had served him perfectly. He'd risen from street-level enforcement to controlling the city's most lucrative criminal operations: gambling, protection, strategic partnerships with legitimate businesses that needed problems solved outside legal frameworks. He'd survived 3 attempts on his life, had eliminated rivals who'd underestimated his willingness to respond with disproportionate violence, had built a reputation that made most conflicts resolve themselves before they required his direct intervention. People feared Dominic Hale. That fear had purchased safety, wealth, and the kind of power that operated beneath official structures but shaped them nonetheless. He lived in a penthouse with security that rivaled government installations. He drove armored vehicles. He employed former military personnel as bodyguards. Every aspect of his life was designed to maintain control through superior force and strategic positioning. Except for Liam. His son had been diagnosed at age 3, autism spectrum disorder, nonverbal, with sensory processing challenges that made everyday environments potentially overwhelming. The diagnosis had arrived like enemy fire from an unexpected direction, shattering Dominic's assumption that his power could protect his child from every threat. He'd responded the only way he knew how, by throwing resources at the problem. The best specialists money could access, intensive therapy programs that cost more annually than most people earned, a specially designed home environment with sensory-friendly lighting, soundproofing, and carefully controlled stimuli, private teachers who understood neurodivergence, medical consultations with experts across 3 countries. Dominic had spent millions trying to buy his son's comfort, trying to create an environment so perfectly controlled that Liam would never experience distress. And to some degree, it had worked. At home, with familiar routines and meticulously managed surroundings, Liam functioned well. He was brilliant with patterns and numbers, could solve puzzles that challenged adults, showed remarkable memory for details others missed. But the world beyond their controlled environment remained chaos that Dominic couldn't eliminate through force or money. Grocery stores with their fluorescent lights and ambient noise, parks with unpredictable sounds and crowds, restaurants like the Imperial where sensory input couldn't be controlled no matter how much Dominic paid for quiet corner tables. Liam's mother, Dominic's ex-wife, had left when their son was 4. She'd tried for a year after the diagnosis, had attended therapy sessions, and read books about autism, had made genuine efforts to understand and support. But the combination of Dominic's criminal life and Liam's intensive needs had proven too much. She'd accepted a generous settlement and relocated across the country, maintaining minimal contact through quarterly video calls that Liam rarely engaged with. Dominic didn't blame her. He sometimes wondered if Liam would be better off in a different situation, with a mother who wasn't connected to organized crime, and a father who understood emotional connection better than strategic intimidation. But Liam was his son, and Dominic had never abandoned anything he considered his, not territory, not business interest, and certainly not the child who carried his name. So he'd adapted. He'd learned about sensory sensitivity, about the importance of routine, about how neurodivergent children experience the world differently rather than deficiently. He'd studied autism with the same focused intensity he'd once applied to learning criminal operations. He'd attended therapy sessions, had practiced communication techniques, had tried to become the father Liam needed rather than the father Dominic knew how to be. But understanding intellectually didn't translate to success practically. Dominic could recite statistics about autism prevalence and explain the neuroscience of sensory processing differences. He could implement every therapeutic strategy his expensive specialists recommended. But he couldn't bridge the fundamental gap between his way of experiencing the world and Liam's. He couldn't understand what it felt like to have sounds physically hurt, to experience fabrics as assault, to process social situations as incomprehensible chaos. He couldn't intuit what Liam needed in moments of distress because Liam couldn't tell him, and Dominic couldn't read the signals that other parents seemed to interpret naturally. Tonight's dinner at the Imperial had been another attempt at normalcy, carefully planned, meticulously prepared, doomed to fail despite every precaution. Dominic had wanted to show Liam that they could do what other families did, that they could exist in public spaces, that autism didn't have to mean isolation. But public spaces meant unpredictable sensory input, meant other people's expectations and judgments, meant that no amount of money or planning could create the controlled environment Liam needed to feel safe. The meltdown had been building from the moment they'd entered. Dominic had recognized the signs but had pushed forward anyway, hoping that exposure therapy would somehow help Liam adapt. That had been foolish, he realized now. You didn't treat sensory sensitivity through exposure to the things that caused pain. You didn't force adaptation to environments that were genuinely overwhelming. He'd made his son suffer because Dominic's pride demanded they appear normal, because admitting that some situations were too much meant admitting the limits of his control. And then the silverware had fallen, and Liam's system had completely overloaded, and every person in the Imperial had turned to witness Dominic Hale's failure as a father played out in real-time screaming and public distress. Dominic had built an empire on never showing weakness, had cultivated a reputation for absolute control, had created a persona that made rivals fear him, and allies respect the precision with which he managed every aspect of his operations. But he couldn't manage his own son's nervous system, couldn't provide comfort through intimidation, couldn't solve sensory overload through strategic planning. He'd been standing there paralyzed, the most powerful man in the city, rendered completely helpless by his 8-year-old's neurological differences, when Maya had approached with her quiet confidence and intuitive understanding. She'd done in seconds what Dominic couldn't accomplish in years. She'd met Liam exactly where he was without trying to change him, without expecting him to adapt to her neurotypical standards. She'd simply offered connection on terms Liam could accept, and his son, his brilliant, struggling, isolated son, had reached back. Dominic stared at this 7-year-old girl, at her mother standing protectively nearby, at the impossible miracle of his son's calm after chaos. And for the first time in 30 years, Dominic Hale understood that some problems couldn't be solved through power. Some needs couldn't be met through money. Some connections required something he'd spent his entire adult life eliminating from his personality: genuine vulnerability and the willingness to accept help from people he couldn't control. His empire was built on dominance, but his son needed something entirely different, and these strangers, this modest black woman and her intuitive daughter, possessed exactly what Dominic's millions couldn't purchase. Danielle Brooks had learned to measure wealth in units that had nothing to do with money. A good day was when Maya came home from school excited about something she'd learned. A great day was when the bills were paid with enough left over for groceries that included fresh fruit. An extraordinary day was when she could afford a small celebration like tonight: dinner at the Imperial to honor her daughter's perfect report card. The splurge had required careful calculation. Danielle worked 2 jobs: daytime receptionist at a medical clinic that paid just enough to cover rent, and evening shifts at a 24-hour convenience store that provided the margin between surviving and drowning. She'd picked up extra hours over the past 3 weeks, had skipped lunches and walked instead of taking the bus, had saved $23 that would buy them the Imperial's most affordable option: a single appetizer plate meant for sharing, which technically qualified them for a table. $23 for dinner at a restaurant where other patrons spent more on wine than Danielle earned in a day. It was ridiculous, financially irresponsible, the kind of choice that her practical mind knew was foolish. But Maya had worked so hard this quarter, had studied vocabulary words while Danielle worked the convenience store counter, had persevered through math problems that challenged her, had earned every A on that report card through genuine effort, and Danielle had promised that achievement deserved celebration somewhere special, somewhere Maya could feel valued not just through words, but through the tangible choice to prioritize joy over practicality for one evening. The hostess at the Imperial had looked at them with the particular expression service workers develop when evaluating customers they suspect can't afford to be there: assessing Danielle's department store dress and Maya's too small outfit, calculating whether they'd embarrass the establishment, deciding how to seat them to minimize their visibility to important patrons. "Table for two?" the hostess had asked, her tone making the question sound like a challenge. "Yes, please," Danielle had replied, her voice carrying the dignity that comes from knowing your worth isn't measured by your bank balance. "We have a reservation under Brooks." The hostess had checked her tablet with exaggerated thoroughness, as if Danielle might be lying about something as minor as a reservation at a restaurant's least desirable time slot. "I have you here. Right this way." They'd been seated near the kitchen entrance, the section reserved for guests the restaurant tolerated rather than welcomed, positioned where they'd be visible to staff, but not to the clientele whose comfort actually mattered. The table was smaller than others, the lighting slightly harsher, the ambient noise from kitchen operations audible in ways that premium-paying customers never experienced. Danielle had recognized the slight immediately, but had chosen not to acknowledge it. Tonight wasn't about confronting discrimination or demanding better treatment. Tonight was about Maya feeling celebrated, and that celebration didn't require premium seating or the hostess's approval. "Mama, look at the chandelier," Maya had whispered, her eyes wide with wonder at the crystal fixture above them that refracted light into rainbow patterns across the white tablecloth. "It's so beautiful." "It really is, baby girl," Danielle had agreed, watching her daughter's joy transform their corner table from slight to privilege, from disappointment to treasure. That was Maya's gift, the ability to find wonder in circumstances that would have defeated adults, to see beauty that others missed because they were too focused on what they lacked. She was 7 years old, brilliant without being arrogant about it, kind without needing reward for kindness, joyful despite living in circumstances that would justify bitterness. Danielle had raised her alone since Maya's father had left when she was pregnant, had received no child support or co-parenting assistance, had navigated single motherhood while working multiple jobs, and somehow maintaining the energy to be present for her daughter's emotional needs. It had been exhausting in ways that didn't show in medical terminology, but manifested in chronic fatigue, in moments of overwhelming stress, in the constant calculation of how to stretch resources that were never quite sufficient. But she'd also built something precious with Maya, a relationship characterized by genuine communication, mutual respect, and the kind of emotional security that money couldn't purchase. They talked about everything. They laughed together at things that weren't expensive but were genuinely funny. They created traditions around free activities like library visits and park walks. They'd built a life that was poor in material resources but rich in connection. Maya had inherited Danielle's warmth but amplified it with a particular intuitive gift. She could read emotions in ways that seemed almost supernatural, sensing when Danielle was stressed even when she tried to hide it, noticing when other children at school were struggling even if they didn't verbalize distress, responding to unspoken needs with empathy that seemed beyond her years. Teachers called her unusually perceptive. Other parents commented on how Maya always noticed when their children needed help. Danielle had learned to trust her daughter's intuitions about people because Maya's assessments were consistently accurate in ways that suggested she was reading signals most people missed. Tonight, reviewing Maya's report card over their shared appetizer, Danielle felt the particular pride that comes from watching your child succeed despite obstacles. Maya attended an underfunded public school with overcrowded classrooms and outdated materials. She did homework in the convenience store where Danielle worked evening shifts, studying under fluorescent lights while her mother rang up purchases. She wore clothes from thrift stores and carried a backpack Danielle had repaired multiple times with duct tape and determination. But none of those disadvantages had prevented Maya from earning perfect marks, from demonstrating that intelligence and work ethic could transcend resource limitations. "You know what this report card tells me?" Danielle said, holding the paper carefully like the treasure it was. "It tells me you're going to do amazing things with your life, baby girl. It tells me that you've got everything inside you that matters: dedication, intelligence, kindness. Those things can't be bought. They're earned through who you choose to be every single day. Maya smiled, the kind of unself-conscious joy that made Danielle's sacrifices feel worthwhile. I worked really hard, Mama. I know you did, and I'm so proud of you. Danielle reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand, the gesture communicating everything that $23 dinners couldn't express. You inspire me, you know that? You make me want to be better, work harder, show you that effort matters more than circumstances. You inspire me too, Maya said simply. You work so hard for us. You never complain. You always find ways to make things special even when money is tight. Danielle felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them back. Tonight was celebration, not sadness. Tonight was about honoring achievement and creating memories that had nothing to do with their bank balance and everything to do with the love they shared. Should we order dessert? Danielle asked, knowing the answer would probably be no, but wanting to offer the possibility. Maybe just share one, Maya suggested carefully, her financial awareness beyond her years. I know it's expensive. We'll see what we can manage, Danielle replied. The familiar non-committal answer that meant she'd find a way, even if it required skipping lunch tomorrow. They were sitting there in their corner table, celebrating their modest triumph, when the screaming started from across the dining room. Maya's head turned immediately toward the sound, her intuitive gift activating, her expression shifting from joy to focused concern. Mama, she said quietly, already standing, that boy needs help. And before Danielle could stop her, before she could explain that wealthy white families didn't want intervention from black girls in too small dresses, Maya was already moving toward the crisis with the confident certainty of someone who recognized suffering and possessed the instinct to alleviate it. Danielle stood quickly, following her daughter, protective instinct overriding everything else, while simultaneously feeling pride that Maya's first response to distress was help rather than judgment. That was the gift she'd given her daughter, the understanding that empathy transcended social hierarchies, that helping others wasn't contingent on whether they could repay you, that genuine kindness required nothing except the willingness to see suffering and respond with compassion. Even when that compassion meant approaching the most dangerous man in the city during his most vulnerable moment, offering connection without knowing whether it would be accepted or rejected. Even when kindness meant risking everything on the possibility that love might be more powerful than fear. The sensory overload had been building since they'd entered the Imperial, accumulating like pressure behind a dam that Liam's nervous system couldn't contain indefinitely. Dominic had recognized the signs, the hand moving toward the ear, the increased rocking, the humming that started soft but was escalating. But he'd miscalculated how quickly his son would reach the breaking point. Liam's fingers had been tracing patterns on the tablecloth, a self-regulatory behavior that usually provided some relief. But the restaurant's ambient noise was too much. Conversations layering over each other in frequencies that neurotypical brains filtered unconsciously, but that Liam experienced as assault. The kitchen sounds bleeding through, despite the Imperial's expensive soundproofing, the subtle vibration of climate control systems, the high-pitched frequency of LED lighting that most people couldn't consciously hear, but that Liam's sensitive auditory processing amplified into physical pain. Dominic had reached for the noise-canceling headphones, but Liam's hand had knocked them away. Not deliberately, but because his motor control was degrading as system overload approached critical threshold. The headphones had fallen, and Liam's hand had followed them down, sweeping across the table, catching the water glass and silverware. The crash of silver against marble flooring was explosive in the hushed dining room, the kind of sound that violated the Imperial's carefully maintained atmosphere of controlled elegance. Every conversation had stopped, every head had turned. The ambient noise had transformed from layered conversations to shocked silence, which somehow felt louder to Dominic than the previous chaos. And then Liam had started screaming. Not crying, not tantrum behavior. Screaming. The primal, desperate sound of a nervous system completely overwhelmed, trying to communicate distress through the only channel available when words weren't possible and every other regulatory mechanism had failed. His hands clamped over his ears, trying to block input that was already past the point where blocking helped. His body rigid with tension, every muscle locked in response to stimuli he couldn't escape or process. The sound cut through the imperial like an alarm, shattering the illusion of refinement, exposing the reality that no amount of money could purchase control over neurology that operated according to its own rules. Dominic had frozen, his mind cycling through every intervention technique he'd learned, finding them all inadequate. Quiet voice wouldn't penetrate Liam's overwhelmed system. Physical comfort would add tactile input to already unbearable sensory load. Removing him from the restaurant required moving through the space that was causing the overload, potentially making everything worse. He was paralyzed by the terrible recognition that nothing in his arsenal of skills, criminal or parental, could address what was happening to his son. The restaurant's reaction was immediate and brutal. At the nearest table, a woman in diamonds and designer clothing made a sound of disgust, her face contorting with the particular expression wealthy people develop when confronted with behavior that violates their expectations of public space. Her companion, a man whose suit probably cost more than a used car, had stood slightly, as if considering leaving rather than tolerating the disruption. "Can't they control that child?" The woman's voice carried across the silent room, pitched to sound concerned but actually communicating judgment. 3 tables away, a business dinner was collapsing as executives exchanged glances that said their important meeting was being ruined by someone's failure to manage their offspring properly. One of them had already signaled for the check, clearly intending to relocate to an establishment that maintained better standards. Near the bar, 2 couples had turned in their chairs to stare openly, their expressions mixing curiosity with contempt. One woman had her phone out, though whether to record the incident or simply to document her disrupted evening wasn't clear. The maitre d' was approaching quickly, his professional courtesy evaporating into barely concealed panic. This was a crisis that threatened the Imperial's reputation. Wealthy patrons being disturbed, the atmosphere of refined elegance shattered, the implicit promise that money purchased insulation from life's messiness being violated in real time. "Mr. Hale," the maitre d' began, his voice low but urgent. "Perhaps it would be better if we—" "If we what?" Dominic interrupted, his tone carrying the edge that preceded violence. "If we leave? If we go somewhere more appropriate for children who don't perform correctly?" The maitre d' had stepped back, recognizing danger, even if he didn't understand its full scope. Dominic Hale was known, feared, really, and confronting him directly was professionally suicidal. But allowing the disruption to continue would cost the Imperial other wealthy patrons, and the calculus of whose satisfaction mattered more was playing out across the maitre d's face. Liam's screaming continued, his body rocking now, hands still clamped over ears, the meltdown fully established and requiring time to cycle through, rather than interventions that would only prolong the distress. Dominic felt the weight of every stare, every judgment, every assessment that said he'd failed as a father by bringing a child who couldn't behave to an establishment that required behavioral control. He was being evaluated and found wanting by people whose opinions normally meant nothing to him, but whose collective judgment now felt crushing. This was humiliation of a type his criminal life had never produced. Rivals had tried to kill him, but those attempts had been respectful acknowledgement of his power. Law enforcement had investigated him, but those inquiries had recognized him as worthy adversary. Even enemies had treated Dominic Hale with the particular courtesy that dangerous men extend to each other. But these wealthy diners weren't treating him with fear or respect. They were treating him with pity and contempt, the way society treats parents whose children expose them as inadequate, whose inability to control their offspring marks them as somehow lesser. Dominic had built his reputation on never showing weakness, had cultivated an image of absolute control, had ensured that everyone who encountered him understood he was the apex predator in any room. But he couldn't control his son's neurology, couldn't intimidate a sensory meltdown into submission, couldn't solve autism through strategic violence or financial leverage. His power was completely publicly useless. A woman at a nearby table had called for the manager, her voice carrying artificial concern that barely masked her demand that something be done about the disruption. Another patron had stood to leave entirely, his departure a statement about the Imperial's declining standards. The silent judgment was worse than the few vocalized complaints. Dominic could feel the collective assessment. This man who supposedly controls half the city can't even manage his own child. The disconnect between his reputation for power and his current helplessness was being noted, catalogued, probably already being texted to contacts who'd spread the story through social networks that mattered. Dominic Hale, feared Mafia boss, reduced to standing helpless while his son screamed and wealthy strangers judged him inadequate. He was preparing to simply pick Liam up and carry him out, despite knowing that would intensify the sensory overload. That removing his son forcibly would be traumatic, but staying was becoming untenable when movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A small girl was approaching, 7 years old maybe, wearing a dress that was too small, moving with quiet confidence through the hostile silence. Her mother was following, reaching after her with protective instinct, but the girl had already reached Liam's table. She'd positioned herself in Liam's line of sight without crowding him, had raised her hand in a slow, deliberate gesture that somehow communicated understanding rather than threat. And impossibly, Liam's screaming had begun to quiet. The restaurant remained frozen, watching this unexpected intervention, seeing whether the disruption would resolve or escalate, judging whether this modest black family's involvement would restore the peace that money had failed to maintain. Dominic watched his son reach toward this stranger's offered connection, watched the meltdown de-escalate through methods he didn't understand, watched his carefully planned evening transform into something he couldn't control but desperately needed, and understood that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected sources, wearing too small dresses and offering empathy that no amount of money could purchase. Maya had felt Liam's distress before she'd consciously heard his screaming, a visceral recognition that bypassed rational thought and activated something deeper in her awareness. She'd been reviewing her report card with her mother, celebrating achievements that represented months of dedicated effort, when the sensation had hit her like a physical wave. Someone was hurting, not physically injured, but overwhelmed in ways that transcended simple discomfort. The feeling was specific, urgent, and impossible to ignore despite her mother's presence and the general understanding that 7-year-old girls didn't approach strangers in expensive restaurants. But Maya had never been particularly good at ignoring suffering when she recognized it. Her teachers called it unusual empathy. Her mother described it as being able to read people's hearts. Maya just knew that sometimes she understood what others needed, even when they couldn't articulate it themselves, and that understanding created responsibility she couldn't dismiss. The screaming had started while she was processing that initial recognition. Most of the Imperial's patrons had reacted with irritation or disgust, their faces showing the particular contempt wealthy people develop for disruptions to their purchased peace. But Maya had looked past the noise to the person producing it. A boy about her age, hands clamped over ears, body rigid with distress that was clearly genuine rather than performative. She'd recognized something in his response that others were missing or choosing to ignore. This wasn't a tantrum designed to manipulate adults into compliance. This was system overload, a nervous system responding to input it couldn't process, distress that was neurological rather than behavioral. Maya didn't know the clinical terminology for what she was observing. She didn't understand autism spectrum disorders or sensory processing challenges in ways that could be articulated through medical language. But she recognized overwhelm when she saw it, understood that the boy was experiencing something genuinely painful, and possessed the instinctive knowledge that connection might provide relief where correction would only intensify suffering. Mama, she'd said quietly, already standing. That boy needs help. Danielle had reached for her immediately, maternal protectiveness overriding everything else. Maya, baby, we should let his parents handle. But Maya was already moving, drawn toward Liam's distress with the same certainty that made her approach crying classmates or comfort upset children at the park. She didn't calculate social appropriateness or consider whether her intervention would be welcomed. She simply recognized suffering and possessed the unshakable conviction that offering help was more important than following unspoken rules about not approaching strangers. She'd crossed the dining room aware that every eye in the Imperial was tracking her movement, that the wealthy patrons were adding her approach to their judgment of the situation, that her mother was following close behind with the protective tension of single black mothers who'd learned that white spaces weren't always safe for their children. But Maya's focus remained on the screaming boy, on reading the signals his overwhelmed system was broadcasting, on intuiting what might provide relief. She'd positioned herself in Liam's line of sight without entering his personal space, understanding instinctively that someone this overwhelmed needed distance rather than proximity, needed predictable movement rather than sudden approach, needed to maintain control over whether and how contact occurred. The screaming had quieted slightly when Liam registered her presence, not because Maya's appearance solved anything, but because something in his overwhelmed processing had recognized that she wasn't a threat, wasn't trying to force interaction, wasn't demanding anything he couldn't provide. Maya had raised her hand slowly, deliberately telegraphing every movement so nothing surprised him. Palm out, fingers spread, held steady at the midpoint between their bodies, not reaching toward him, not invading space, just offering a visual focal point that was predictable and safe. Then she'd begun a simple rhythmic pattern, tapping her thumb against each finger in sequence, creating a visual rhythm that was steady, predictable, calming. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The movement was hypnotic without being demanding, engaging without requiring response, providing external regulation through predictable pattern. Her other hand moved to her chest, fingers tapping gently over her heart. 1, 2, 3, 4. The same rhythm, creating visual and implied tactile pattern that communicated, here is steadiness, here is rhythm, here is something your overwhelmed system can match and regulate against. Liam's screaming had diminished further, his rigid body beginning to soften slightly as his nervous system registered the external regulation Maya was providing. His eyes had locked onto her moving fingers, tracking the pattern with the focused intensity of someone finding anchor in chaos. Maya maintained the rhythm without variation, her expression calm and patient, communicating through posture and presence that she would continue this pattern for as long as Liam needed it. No judgment, no expectation that he would speak or respond conventionally, just steady, reliable regulation offered without conditions. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. She'd hummed softly, not words, just a gentle sound that matched the rhythm of her tapping fingers. The tone was soothing, without being infantilizing, providing auditory regulation to complement the visual pattern. Her voice carried no urgency, no demand for response, just steady presence that said, "You're safe. I understand. You're not alone in this overwhelm." Liam's hands had begun to lower from his ears, his desperate attempt to block overwhelming input relaxing as his system recognized that Maya's predictable patterns were reducing rather than adding to sensory chaos. His own hand had started to rise, slowly, hesitantly, until his palm matched hers, not quite touching but mirroring her position across the space between them. Maya had smiled gently, acknowledging his participation without making it a big deal, continuing her rhythmic tapping. 1, 2, 3, 4. She'd adjusted slightly so their hands were perfectly aligned, creating a visual symmetry that provided additional regulation through pattern and predictability. Then she'd done something extraordinary. She'd begun alternating her finger tapping with moments of stillness, tap, 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 pause. creating a pattern that had variation but remained predictable, engaging Liam's pattern recognition abilities while providing the regulatory benefit of rhythm. Liam's fingers had begun to move, mimicking her pattern. Tap, 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 pause. His movements were less fluid than hers. His motor control still compromised by residual overwhelm, but he was participating in the regulatory dance Maya had initiated. The screaming had stopped completely now. Liam's breathing was slowing toward normal rhythm. His body language was shifting from rigid panic to engaged focus. The meltdown was de-escalating, not through suppression, but through regulation, through external patterns that his overwhelmed system could match and organize around. Maya maintained her steady presence, her rhythmic tapping, her gentle humming, providing the scaffolding Liam's nervous system needed to return from overload to baseline. She didn't rush the process or try to accelerate his recovery. She simply offered consistent, predictable regulation for as long as he needed it. Around them, the Imperial's wealthy patrons watched in stunned silence. The disruption that had threatened their expensive evening was resolving through the intervention of a 7-year-old girl in a too-small dress, offering connection that no amount of money could have purchased. Danielle stood behind her daughter, her hand on Maya's shoulder, protective but allowing the interaction to continue. She recognized what Maya was doing even if she couldn't articulate the neurological mechanisms. Her daughter was providing what the overwhelmed boy needed through pure intuition and practiced empathy. And Dominic Hale, the most feared man in the city, stood beside his son watching a child he'd never met accomplish in 90 seconds what his millions and his power and his desperate love had never achieved. His son was connecting with another human being, voluntarily, joyfully, through methods that respected rather than tried to override his neurodivergent experience. Maya glanced up at Dominic briefly, her expression carrying neither pride nor expectation of praise. She was simply doing what felt right, offering help to someone who needed it, providing regulation without judgment, demonstrating that sometimes the most profound interventions required nothing except genuine empathy and the willingness to meet people exactly where they were. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythm continued, steady and sure, building a bridge between two children across the distance that separated their worlds. A bridge constructed from nothing except patience, understanding, and the revolutionary recognition that connection didn't require words when hearts spoke the same language. Dominic Hale had negotiated with cartel leaders across 3 continents. He'd orchestrated complex operations requiring split-second timing and absolute precision. He'd read people's intentions through micro-expressions and body language, had learned to detect deception in voices that claimed loyalty, had developed the predator's gift for recognizing weakness before his opponents understood they were vulnerable. But he'd never witnessed anything like what Danielle Brooks was doing now. She'd moved to Maya's side the moment her daughter had initiated contact with Liam, positioning herself protectively, but not interfering with the connection the children were building. Her hand rested lightly on Maya's shoulder, present without controlling, supportive without smothering. She was monitoring the situation with the focused intensity of someone who understood that genuine help required knowing when to act and when to simply bear witness. Liam's breathing had steadied into something approaching normal rhythm. The rigid tension in his small body was dissolving under Maya's patient regulation. The meltdown that had seemed unstoppable minutes earlier was cycling down through stages that Dominic recognized but had never successfully facilitated. From full crisis to trembling aftermath to tentative reorientation. And Danielle was guiding this recovery without ever touching Liam, without speaking to him directly, without inserting herself into the delicate space Maya had created. "You're doing beautiful, baby girl," Danielle said quietly to her daughter, her voice pitched to praise without disrupting. "Just keep that rhythm steady. He's following you perfectly." The words were simple, but Dominic heard layers beneath them. Danielle was reinforcing Maya's technique while simultaneously providing coaching, was celebrating success while maintaining focus. was nurturing her daughter's natural gift while ensuring she understood the responsibility it carried. This wasn't amateur kindness. This was practiced emotional intelligence deployed with surgical precision. Maya adjusted her hand position slightly, and Liam's hand moved to match. The connection between them was developing language, not verbal, but profound nonetheless. They were communicating through pattern and rhythm, through mirrored movement and shared focus, through the kind of intuitive understanding that bypassed conventional social requirements entirely. Dominic had spent years trying to reach his son, had employed specialists who charged obscene fees, had implemented therapeutic protocols designed by experts with decades of experience, had read research papers about autism and sensory processing until the terminology became second nature. But he'd never achieved what this 7-year-old girl had accomplished in 90 seconds: genuine connection on terms Liam could accept. And he was beginning to understand that the difference wasn't technique or knowledge. The difference was something far more fundamental that Danielle possessed, and he'd spent 30 years eliminating from his personality. She wasn't trying to fix Liam, wasn't approaching his neurodivergence as problem requiring solution, wasn't imposing neurotypical expectations onto experience she recognized as different rather than deficient. She was simply meeting him where he was, without judgment or agenda, beyond offering support he could accept or refuse according to his own needs. Danielle's gaze swept across the dining room, taking in the watching patrons with an expression that managed to be both dignified and quietly defiant. She wasn't apologizing for the disruption, wasn't showing embarrassment or requesting tolerance. Her posture communicated something Dominic recognized from his own world, though applied to entirely different circumstances. I have every right to be here. My daughter has every right to offer help. Your comfort is not more important than this child's well-being. The wealthy diners looked away first, returning to their meals with the discomfort of people who'd been confronted with humanity that violated their preferred narratives about class and capability. Dominic had achieved similar dominance through intimidation and the implicit threat of violence. Danielle had accomplished it through moral authority that required no enforcement beyond her absolute certainty in her own worth. "Mama," Maya said softly, "I think he's okay now." Danielle knelt beside her daughter, bringing herself to the children's eye level, her movement fluid and unthreatening. "You did something really special, baby. You saw someone hurting, and you helped without thinking about yourself. I'm so proud of you." Then she looked at Liam directly, her expression warm without being overwhelming. "You're very brave," she told him gently. "It's hard when everything feels like too much, isn't it? But you came through it. You're safe now." Liam didn't respond verbally. Couldn't, Dominic knew, but something in his posture shifted. Some recognition that Danielle's words carried respect rather than pity. Understanding rather than condescension. Dominic watched this woman address his son with more genuine connection in 30 seconds than most people managed in extended interactions. Watched her honor Liam's experience without trying to minimize or normalize it. Watched her demonstrate that emotional intelligence wasn't weakness or sentiment. It was power of a type his empire had never recognized. She stood gracefully, her hand returning to Maya's shoulder, preparing to guide her daughter back to their table and allow the Hales whatever privacy they needed to recover. And Dominic understood with absolute clarity that letting Danielle Brooks walk away would be the most catastrophic mistake of his life. Not because of what she could do for his son, though that was extraordinary, but because she possessed something his millions couldn't purchase and his power couldn't intimidate into existence: the ability to see people's essential humanity beneath their circumstances and respond to that truth with patience, empathy, and natural authority that required no enforcement beyond its own moral weight. "Wait," Dominic said, his voice carrying command even when requesting rather than demanding. "Please, don't leave yet." Danielle turned to face him fully, her expression cautious but not fearful, assessing him with the same careful intelligence she'd applied to managing the aftermath of Liam's crisis. And in her eyes, Dominic saw his own reflection transformed. Not the feared mafia boss, not the powerful criminal operator, but simply a desperate father who'd just witnessed someone accomplish what he couldn't. Offering connection, his son needed more than protection his money could provide. "We need to talk," Dominic said quietly. "About Liam, about what your daughter just did, about what you both clearly understand that I'm still trying to learn." Danielle's expression shifted slightly, recognition, perhaps, that something significant was beginning, something that would transform all four of their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. Danielle had encountered powerful men before, doctors who spoke over her concerns about Maya's health, landlords who wielded eviction threats like weapons, managers who reminded her that single mothers with limited options should feel grateful for any employment. She'd learned to read the particular body language of men accustomed to getting what they wanted, had developed the careful navigation required to maintain dignity while acknowledging power imbalances she couldn't directly challenge. But Dominic Hale was different. Not because he was less dangerous. She recognized that beneath his expensive suit and careful courtesy lived something far more threatening than any landlord or dismissive manager. But because the way he was looking at her now carried none of the predatory assessment she'd learned to anticipate from powerful men encountering women they believed they could control. He was looking at her with something closer to desperation. They'd moved to a private corner of the Imperial's bar area, away from the dining room's judgmental audience. Maya and Liam remained visible through glass partitions, still connected through their gentle hand mirroring, still building whatever wordless language they'd discovered together. The restaurant's manager had offered the space with nervous deference that suggested he understood exactly who Dominic was and how precarious any situation involving him could become. Dominic had paid their bill, both his and Danielle's, before she could object, the gesture executed with such casual efficiency that protest would have been pointless. He'd arranged for two of the Imperial's staff to supervise the children at a distance, ensuring their safety while allowing the adults privacy for whatever conversation was about to unfold. Now they sat across from each other at a small table, and Danielle watched him struggle with words in ways that suggested this particular speech hadn't been rehearsed or practiced like business negotiations he normally conducted. "I'm going to be direct because I don't know how else to approach this," Dominic began, his hands resting flat on the table in a gesture that looked almost like surrender. "What your daughter did tonight, what you clearly taught her to do, is something I've spent years and more money than most people see in lifetimes trying to provide for my son, and she accomplished it in 90 seconds through pure instinct and empathy." Danielle said nothing, waiting, her expression neutral but attentive. She'd learned that powerful people often revealed more when allowed to fill silence rather than when interrupted or challenged prematurely. "I've employed specialists from 3 countries," Dominic continued. "Therapists with decades of experience, behavioral consultants who charge $5,000 an hour, medical experts who've published research papers about autism and sensory processing, and none of them, not one, has ever connected with Liam the way Maya did tonight." He paused, seeming to recalibrate his approach, and Danielle saw something she hadn't expected: genuine vulnerability beneath the controlled exterior. "I know who you are," Dominic said quietly. "Or rather, I know your circumstances. Single mother, 2 jobs, living paycheck to paycheck in a neighborhood that's not safe, raising a brilliant daughter with resources that are criminally insufficient for what she deserves." Danielle's spine stiffened slightly, protective instinct activating. "You had me investigated?" "I made a phone call," Dominic admitted without apology. "I needed to understand who I was about to make an offer to. I needed to know whether you'd accept for the right reasons or simply because money makes most problems disappear." "And what did your investigation tell you?" Her voice carried edge now, dignity asserting itself against the presumption of men who believed information purchased understanding. "That you've worked yourself to exhaustion for 7 years trying to give Maya opportunities that wealth buys automatically. that you've never missed rent, despite it requiring sacrifices that would break most people, that every teacher at her school mentions your involvement and dedication, that you're exactly the kind of person who might refuse what I'm about to offer because pride matters more than convenience. He leaned forward slightly, intensity replacing vulnerability. I want to hire you. Not as a nanny or a therapist or any conventional position with job descriptions that limit what you'd actually be doing. I want you to be Liam's consultant, to teach me what you clearly understand about connecting with children who experience the world differently, to help me become the father he needs, rather than the father I keep failing to be. Danielle processed this carefully, looking for the trap she assumed existed in any offer that sounded too beneficial. What exactly would this position entail? Whatever you determine Liam needs, Dominic said simply. Full-time hours if necessary. Flexible schedule built around Maya's school and your requirements as her mother. Complete authority over Liam's care and development strategies. Access to any resources or specialists you believe would help. A salary that would allow you to stop working 2 jobs and actually have time to be present for your own daughter. He named a figure that made Danielle's breath catch, despite her attempt to maintain composed neutrality. It was more than she earned in a year from both jobs combined. More than would simply solve her immediate financial crisis. It was enough to create actual security, to build savings, to give Maya opportunities that had existed only as distant possibilities. Why? Danielle asked bluntly. You could hire credentialed professionals with that money, people with degrees and licenses and years of documented experience. Why would you offer this to someone you just met? Because credentials don't teach what you possess, Dominic replied. Because Maya connected with my son in ways that all those documented years of experience never achieved. Because you clearly understand something fundamental about human connection that can't be learned from textbooks or research papers. He paused, and Danielle saw the calculation behind his eyes, the assessment of how much truth to reveal, how much vulnerability to expose to someone he barely knew. Because I'm desperate, he admitted finally. Because I've watched my son struggle for years and I can't help him. Because everything I've built, all my power and money and control, is completely useless when Liam needs me most. And because tonight, I watched you and Maya offer something I didn't know existed. Genuine understanding without agenda, connection without conditions, help that didn't require anything except willingness to see my son as valuable exactly as he is. Danielle studied him carefully, reading truth beneath practiced control, recognizing desperation that money couldn't disguise. She thought of Maya, of the opportunities this salary would provide, of the security that would replace constant financial anxiety. She thought of Liam, of the connection he'd found with her daughter, of the possibility that she might actually help this struggling child in ways his father's resources hadn't managed. And she thought of the cost, because nothing came without price, and powerful men always collected what they believed they were owed. I need to think about this, she said finally. I need to talk to Maya. And I need guarantees about what this position actually means, boundaries, expectations. What happens if it doesn't work? Dominic nodded slowly. That's fair. Take whatever time you need. But Danielle, his voice carried unusual earnestness. Please don't dismiss this because you think there's some hidden agenda. I'm offering you this because my son needs what you can provide. Everything else is negotiable. Danielle had taken exactly 12 hours to make her decision. Not because the choice was difficult. Watching Maya's face light up when Liam had responded to her had made the emotional calculus simple. But because accepting Dominic Hale's offer required preparation that went beyond enthusiasm or financial desperation, she'd spent the night after their imperial encounter researching what little public information existed about him, had made discreet inquiries through her network of other working mothers who knew things that never appeared in newspapers, had consulted with Maya about how she'd felt helping Liam and whether she'd want to spend more time with him. Every source had confirmed what she'd already intuited. Dominic Hale was dangerous in ways that transcended physical threat. He controlled systems that operated beneath legal surface. People who crossed him experienced consequences that were never officially connected to his name, but were universally understood as his work. He existed in the space between legitimate business and organized crime, wielding power that made conventional authorities cautious about direct confrontation. But every source had also mentioned something unexpected. He was absolutely devoted to his son. Had never used Liam as leverage in business negotiations. Had maintained separation between his criminal operations and his parental responsibilities with discipline that suggested genuine protective instinct rather than strategic calculation. That devotion, more than the salary, had convinced Danielle that working with Dominic might be possible. Because a man who genuinely loved his child and recognized his own limitations might be capable of growth that purely transactional relationships wouldn't facilitate. Now she sat across from him again, this time in his downtown office, a space that managed to be both luxurious and quietly threatening, with art that probably cost more than most people's homes, and security measures that were visible enough to communicate capability without being crude enough to appear paranoid. "I've made my decision," Danielle said, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was about to commit to. "I'll accept your offer, but not on the terms you proposed." Dominic's expression shifted slightly, surprised, perhaps, that she'd approached this as negotiation rather than grateful acceptance. "What terms do you want?" "First, I'm not your employee," Danielle stated clearly. "I'm your partner in Liam's care. That means my voice carries equal weight to yours in decisions about his well-being, his schedule, his therapeutic approaches, everything that affects his development. You don't override my judgment because you're paying me. You don't dismiss my concerns because you have more experience running organizations. When it comes to Liam, we're equals." She watched him process this, saw the instinctive resistance of a man accustomed to hierarchies where his word was final, followed by something more interesting, consideration that suggested he might actually be capable of accepting partnership rather than demanding subordination. "Second, my daughter Maya is not your employee, not your tool, and not someone you get to control or direct," Danielle continued, her tone hardening slightly. "She helped Liam because that's who she is, kind, intuitive, empathetic. But she's 7 years old, and she's my responsibility to protect. If she wants to spend time with Liam, wonderful. If she develops a genuine friendship with him, even better. But you don't get to expect her availability or treat her connection with your son as something you've purchased access to." Dominic nodded slowly. "Understood. Maya's participation is voluntary, not contractual. Third, I need boundaries between your business life and my work with Liam," Danielle said firmly. "I don't want to know details about your operations. I don't want to be positioned where I might witness or overhear things that could make me legally complicit or put me in danger. You keep those worlds separated, or this arrangement ends immediately." "That's already how I operate," Dominic replied. "Liam's life has always been separate from my business interests. That won't change." "Fourth, I need guaranteed time for my own daughter," Danielle stated. "Maya's school events, her needs, her childhood, those don't get sacrificed because Liam requires attention. I'll be fully present when I'm working with your son, but when I'm mothering mine, that time is sacred and non-negotiable." "Agreed. Your schedule accommodates Maya first, Liam second." Danielle leaned forward slightly, her expression intensifying. "And finally, the most important term, you treat me with respect. Not the careful courtesy powerful men show to people they're tolerating, not the patronizing kindness wealthy people extend to those they pity. Genuine respect that acknowledges I know things you don't, that values my expertise even though it wasn't purchased through expensive degrees, that recognizes my intelligence and judgment as equal to yours despite our different circumstances." She held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away or soften her demand. "I've worked for men who said the right things but communicated through every gesture and tone that they considered me lesser, less educated, less capable, less worthy of consideration. I won't work that way again. Either you genuinely respect me as a person of equal value who happens to possess different knowledge, or this conversation ends now and you find someone else to help your son. The silence that followed was weighted with assessment. Dominic was clearly evaluating whether he could actually function within the constraints Danielle was establishing, whether his ego would tolerate genuine partnership with someone he'd initially approached from a position of superior power. You realize what you're asking is harder for me than simply paying you more money, Dominic said finally, his voice carrying unexpected honesty. I've built my entire life on hierarchies where I occupy the top position, where my judgment supersedes everyone else's because I've proven my capability through results that speak for themselves. You're asking me to surrender control in ways that go against every instinct I've developed. I'm asking you to recognize that control isn't what your son needs, Danielle replied quietly. He needs connection, understanding, patience, things that can't be commanded or purchased. Either you're willing to meet me as an equal partner in providing those things, or you're not ready for what this arrangement actually requires. Dominic studied her with an intensity that would have been intimidating if Danielle hadn't already decided she wouldn't be intimidated. She'd survived 7 years of single motherhood on insufficient resources. She'd navigated systems designed to keep people like her struggling. She'd maintained dignity through circumstances that would have justified bitterness. A wealthy criminal's assessment couldn't shake foundations she'd built through surviving experiences his money had insulated him from. You're right, Dominic said finally, the admission clearly costing him something. Everything you've said is right. And yes, I agree to your terms. Equal partnership in Liam's care, respect for Maya's autonomy, separation between my business and our work, protected time for your daughter, and genuine respect, not performed courtesy, but actual acknowledgement that you possess expertise I lack. He extended his hand across the desk. Partners, then, in helping my son become whoever he's meant to be. Danielle took his hand, feeling the strength in his grip, but also something unexpected. Vulnerability that suggested this handshake represented more than business agreement. It was admission that Dominic Hale, the man who controlled half the city's criminal operations, needed help he couldn't command into existence. Partners, she agreed. And Dominic, if you ever violate these terms, if you ever treat me or Maya with anything less than the respect we're worth, I walk away immediately. Your money won't keep me where I'm not valued. Understood, Dominic said quietly. And Danielle? Thank you. For seeing past what I am to what my son needs. For being brave enough to demand what you're worth. For teaching me that some forms of power require surrendering control. Danielle nodded, releasing his hand, already thinking about what Liam would need first. What strategies might help him? How to build on the connection Maya had initiated. She was stepping into a world she didn't fully understand, partnering with a dangerous man for his vulnerable son's benefit, risking stability and safety on the belief that she could actually help. But watching Maya and Liam discover their wordless language had shown her something profound. Sometimes the most important work required courage that had nothing to do with credentials and everything to do with recognizing shared humanity beneath different circumstances. And that was expertise no amount of money could purchase. Only lived experience could teach. The arrangement began on a Tuesday morning in September, with autumn light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dominic's penthouse. He'd had a section of the space redesigned according to Danielle's specifications, softer lighting, noise-dampening materials installed in the walls, a dedicated sensory room with weighted blankets and textured objects that provided regulation without overwhelming stimulation. The modifications had cost more than most people earned annually, but Dominic had learned that his money was finally being spent correctly, not trying to fix Liam, but creating environments where his son could simply exist comfortably. Maya had arrived with Danielle that first morning wearing a backpack and carrying the careful excitement of children approaching something wonderful but unfamiliar. Liam had been waiting in the main living area, his hands moving through the repetitive patterns that provided comfort when anxiety built. He'd seen Maya through the entrance, and his stimming had stopped mid-gesture, his entire focus shifting to her presence with an intensity that Dominic had rarely witnessed. Maya had crossed the space between them without hesitation, had raised her hand in that same palm-out gesture from the Imperial, and Liam's hand had lifted to mirror hers before Danielle had even finished greeting Dominic. That had been 6 weeks ago. Since then, Dominic had witnessed a friendship develop that defied every conventional understanding he possessed about human connection. They communicated primarily without words, though Maya spoke constantly and Liam remained nonverbal. Their actual exchange of meaning occurred through systems that bypassed language entirely. Maya had learned to read Liam's hand gestures, his body language, the subtle shifts in his stimming patterns that indicated different emotional states. Liam had developed signals that Maya interpreted with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. A particular finger tap meant he wanted to show her something. A specific rocking rhythm meant he was overwhelmed and needed space. A certain hum indicated happiness that couldn't be expressed through conventional channels. They'd created their own language, built from intuition and patience, and the particular understanding that children possessed before adults taught them that different meant wrong. Dominic watched them now from his home office, where glass walls allowed him to observe without intruding. They were in the sensory room, engaged in what Danielle called parallel play, existing in the same space, aware of each other, but not requiring constant interaction. Maya was drawing with colored pencils, her movements deliberate and focused. Liam was arranging pattern blocks in increasingly complex geometric designs, his brilliant spatial reasoning creating structures that would challenge adults. But every few minutes, one would glance at the other. Maya would hold up her drawing for Liam's brief inspection, and he'd pause his building to acknowledge her work with a gentle tap against his chest, his signal for appreciation. Liam would complete a particularly satisfying pattern and would hum softly, and Maya would look up and smile, sharing his quiet joy without needing explanation. They weren't constantly engaged with each other, but they were constantly aware of each other. Their friendship existed in the spaces between interaction, in the comfort of shared presence, in the security of knowing someone understood you without requiring performance or translation. Dominic had never experienced anything like it. His relationships, even before his criminal life had complicated everything, had been transactional. Business partnerships built on mutual benefit, romantic relationships that provided specific needs but required constant negotiation of terms. Even his connection with Liam, though genuine love existed beneath everything, was characterized by Dominic's desperate attempts to provide rather than simply be present. But watching Maya and Liam, he witnessed something he'd never known was possible. Connection without agenda, friendship without conditions, love that required nothing except willingness to see and be seen. "They're teaching him things I couldn't," Danielle said quietly, appearing beside him. She'd developed the habit of working from Dominic's penthouse several days a week, coordinating Liam's care while Maya was present, creating an environment where both children could thrive. Maya's teaching him that relationships don't have to be exhausting, that he doesn't need to perform neurotypical behavior to be valued, that someone can understand him exactly as he is. "What's he teaching her?" Dominic asked, genuinely curious. "That communication is bigger than words," Danielle replied, her eyes on the children. "That patience reveals things rushing misses. That different perspectives make the world richer rather than more complicated." She paused, then added softly, "That love doesn't require sameness, just willingness to meet someone where they are." Dominic felt something uncomfortable shifting in his chest. Recognition, perhaps, of how isolated he'd become, how his entire life was constructed around control rather than connection, how even his love for Liam was expressed through providing and protecting rather than simply being present with his son's experience. "I don't know how to do what they're doing," he admitted quietly, the confession costing him something. "I don't know how to just Be with someone without trying to manage outcomes or control variables. Danielle turned to face him, her expression carrying unexpected gentleness. You're learning. Slowly, but you're learning. You hired me instead of trying to control everything yourself. That was connection over control. You accepted my terms instead of demanding subordination. That was respect over power. You're letting Maya and Liam build their friendship organically instead of trying to direct or optimize it. That's trust over management. It feels like failure, Dominic said, watching my son connect with people more easily than he connects with me. Realizing that everything I built, all my power and resources, can't create what they have naturally. It's not failure, Danielle replied firmly. It's recognition. You're seeing what actually matters, what your son actually needs, what genuine connection looks like. That awareness is the first step toward participating in it, rather than just facilitating it for others. In the sensory room, Maya had moved closer to Liam, showing him something in her drawing. Liam's hand reached out slowly, tracing the lines she'd created with fascinated focus. Maya held perfectly still, allowing his exploration, her patience communicating safety that required no verbal confirmation. Then Liam did something extraordinary. He took Maya's hand gently and placed it on his pattern blocks, guiding her fingers to trace the geometric design he'd constructed. Sharing his world with her the way she'd shared hers with him, creating reciprocity through mutual vulnerability. Maya's face lit up with joy, her smile communicating that she understood the significance of Liam's invitation, even if she couldn't articulate why it mattered. Dominic felt his throat tighten watching them, recognizing something profound in their exchange. They weren't just friends. They were teaching each other how to be fully human. Maya learning that words weren't required for deep connection, Liam learning that sharing his internal experience wouldn't result in rejection or misunderstanding. I want what they have, Dominic said quietly, surprising himself with the admission. Not with them. They have each other. But I want to know how to connect like that. How to be present without agenda. How to love people without trying to control outcomes. Danielle's hand touched his arm briefly, the gesture carrying more comfort than any words she might offer. Then you practice. You observe what they're teaching. You risk being vulnerable instead of powerful. You choose connection over control, even when control feels safer. She smiled slightly. And you let yourself be changed by people you can't control, like Liam, like Maya, like maybe even me, instead of trying to change them to fit your preferred patterns. Dominic nodded slowly, watching his son and this remarkable little girl who'd somehow become essential to both Hale lives, understanding that the most important transformation wasn't happening in Liam. It was happening in him, the slow, painful, necessary evolution from man who controlled everything to father who could simply be present with his son's beautiful, challenging, perfectly valid way of experiencing the world. And for the first time in 30 years, Dominic Hale chose growth over power, chose vulnerability over control, chose connection over the isolation that had kept him safe, but completely, desperately alone. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Dominic couldn't simply walk away from 30 years of criminal infrastructure, couldn't dismantle an empire built through violence and strategic intimidation without consequences that would ripple through systems he'd spent decades constructing. But he could choose which operations to maintain and which to slowly divest from, could create distance between himself and the most dangerous elements of his business, could build walls between his family life and the criminal enterprise that had once defined his entire existence. He started by relocating them, not just Liam, but Danielle and Maya too. The penthouse had been secure, but felt increasingly wrong, tainted by associations with his old life, with meetings conducted in rooms where his children now played, with security measures designed to repel threats that his current priorities made unacceptable. The new house was in a gated community 40 minutes from the city, surrounded by acres that provided privacy without isolation. It had dedicated spaces for each child. Liam's sensory room expanded and perfected. Maya's bedroom decorated according to preferences Danielle had described with tears in her eyes, because someone was finally asking what her daughter wanted rather than what circumstances forced her to accept. There was a shared playroom where the children's friendship could flourish, a kitchen large enough for family meals, gardens where both kids could explore at their own pace. Danielle had her own suite, separate but connected, providing independence while acknowledging that they were building something together, even if neither could yet articulate exactly what that something was. It wasn't romance, though Dominic had caught himself watching her with feelings that transcended partnership. It wasn't simply co-parenting, though that's what their arrangement technically resembled. It was something more fundamental. Chosen family built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the recognition that they'd each found in the other something essential that had been missing. The first dinner in their new home had been chaotic in ways that would have stressed Liam in his previous environment, but that the carefully designed space accommodated perfectly. Maya had chattered excitedly about her new school, private, well-funded, where teachers actually had time to nurture rather than just manage students. Liam had eaten his preferred foods without anyone commenting on the limited variety, had left the table when overwhelmed without it becoming a crisis, had returned when ready to rejoin without needing explanation or apology. Dominic and Danielle had cleaned up together afterward, working in comfortable silence that spoke of growing familiarity, of partnership that was becoming friendship, of connection built through shared commitment rather than romantic intention. "This feels impossible," Danielle had said quietly, drying dishes while Dominic washed. "6 months ago, I was working 2 jobs, wondering how to pay rent. Now my daughter has her own bedroom, in a house with a garden, attends a school I couldn't have dreamed of affording, and I'm partners with a man who used to terrify me." "Do I still terrify you?" Dominic had asked, genuinely uncertain what answer he wanted. "Sometimes," Danielle admitted. "When I remember who you were, who you still are in parts of your life I don't see, but mostly you're just Liam's father, someone trying as hard as I am to give our kids what they deserve, someone who's learning that power and control aren't the same as safety and love." Dominic had nodded, accepting her honesty, grateful she didn't pretend he'd completely transformed. He hadn't. He still maintained criminal operations, still made decisions that would horrify her if she knew details he carefully kept hidden. But he was changing in ways that mattered more than his business arrangements, learning to be present without managing, to love without controlling, to build family through vulnerability rather than dominance. The children had adapted seamlessly to their new arrangement. Maya and Liam had rooms on the same hallway, could visit each other freely, had developed routines that accommodated both their needs. Maya would check on Liam each morning with their hand gesture greeting. Liam would wait by the window when Maya's school bus was due home. They'd spend afternoons in comfortable companionship, sometimes playing together, often existing in parallel contentment, always aware of each other's presence. Watching them, Dominic finally understood what Danielle had been trying to teach him. Family wasn't about blood or obligation, wasn't about control or providing or protecting against every possible threat. Family was about showing up consistently, about creating space where people could be themselves completely, about loving without conditions or expectations of reciprocal performance. 3 months into their new arrangement, Danielle had found him in his home office late one evening, staring at documents that represented decisions about his criminal enterprise's future. "You're trying to figure out how to leave, aren't you?" she'd asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Part of it," Dominic admitted. "Enough that Liam grows up without his father's business defining his possibilities. Enough that you and Maya aren't perpetually at risk because of my associations." "That's not what I'm asking for," Danielle said carefully. "I'm not demanding you become someone different. I'm just asking that you keep being the person you're becoming, the father who prioritizes his son's emotional needs, the partner who respects boundaries, the man who's learning that vulnerability isn't weakness. Dominic had looked at her. This woman who'd somehow become essential, not just to Liam's well-being, but to his own evolution, who challenged him without judgment, who saw both who he was and who he might become, and offered partnership toward the better version. "I never expected this," he said quietly. "When I approached you at the Imperial, I thought I was hiring help. Didn't realize I was inviting transformation. Didn't understand that saving my son would require saving myself from the isolation I'd built so carefully." "We're all saving each other," Danielle replied gently. "You gave Maya and me security we'd never known. We're giving you and Liam connection you'd never experienced. The children are teaching all of us that love is bigger than circumstances. That family is built through choice, that the deepest bonds form when we risk being fully seen." She'd stood, moved to the window where autumn light was fading into evening. "I don't know what we're building here, Dominic. It doesn't look like anything conventional. Criminal father, struggling single mother, autistic boy, intuitive girl, all living together in a house that shouldn't work but somehow does. But whatever it is, it feels right. Feels like home." Dominic had joined her at the window, watching their children visible in the garden below. Maya showing Liam something she'd discovered, Liam's attention fully engaged, both of them existing in perfect harmony that required no words or performance. "Home," Dominic repeated softly. "I spent 30 years building an empire and never understood what that word actually meant. Thought it was about security and control and protection against threats. Didn't realize home was just people who see you completely and choose to stay anyway." Danielle's hand had found his, the gesture carrying everything they couldn't yet articulate. Partnership becoming friendship, becoming something deeper that neither rushed to define. Below them, their children laughed together, building a future none of the adults could have imagined, but all of them were committed to protecting. And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Dominic Hale understood that the most valuable things couldn't be taken or built or controlled, only received with gratitude when love offered what money never could. Belonging without conditions, family without hierarchies, home built from vulnerability and sustained through choice rather than obligation. They were unexpected family, unconventional family, imperfect family, learning together how to transform isolation into connection, how to build safety through love rather than control, how to create space where everyone could be fully themselves without fear or judgment. And that was everything Dominic had never known he needed, everything his power had never purchased, everything his son had always deserved. It was simply home. Hit the subscribe button now if you enjoyed this story, because you will surely love the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end and see you in the next one.